Empathy is one of the core conditions and is something that you really should be trying to offer to a client throughout every moment of your time together. It isn't something that you apply as a skill at certain times. Sometimes students in the past have written about empathy and written about their time with a client saying that they applied empathy, and I've often taken issue with it because I don't think it's something that you should apply at certain times. It's a way that you are with the client at all times. Roger's most famous description of empathy is this below: to sense the client's private world as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as if quality. By that he means you need to be aware of their feelings as best you can and step into their subjective world, but that doesn't mean that you need to take on their feelings in order to be empathic. This reminds me a little bit of a time when I just started my placement, when I was training, and I had somebody who was quite anxious in the room and talking about anxiety and how I had some anxiety myself, I suppose, about how early I was in the placement and how, I'd not really gotten used to the role of a therapist yet. And I wondered afterwards if I had been particularly empathic in this way or if it was just two anxious people in a room. And to extend the quote a little bit, he says, to sense the client's anger, fear or confusion as if it were your own, yet without your own anger, fear or confusion getting bound up in it, is the condition we're endeavouring to describe. And I feel as though in my example, I let my own anxiety about my newfound role as a therapist get mixed up in the anxiety that the client was bringing, and it wasn't ideal. If you're anxious and you're going to a therapist to explore that anxiety, you're going to want to feel heard, but you probably don't want your therapist to get anxious with you. And this goes back to self-awareness and the personal exploration that you need to do in training to be a therapist, because you can only spot your own anxiety or anger or fear or any other feelings and separate them from what the client's saying if you are aware enough of your own stuff to begin with. If you're not aware of your own feelings, then you're not going to be as good at putting them to one side, spotting them, putting them to one side and focusing on the client in front of you. Your feelings and the client's feelings are much more likely to get mixed together, and it's not necessarily going to be about the client's frame of reference anymore. I do save some of my attention for what's going on inside myself, though, to keep tabs on any emotional reaction I feel I'm having inwardly, and to just keep aware of it, because if I'm not aware of it, that can spill out into the room and my responses can end up being about me and my feelings rather than the client's. This is somewhat of a balancing act, though. If I have prevailing feelings that for whatever reason I feel might be helpful to share for the client's benefit in whatever way, then there may be a time and place for me to share what's going on inside of myself, but that's always a balancing act and I always need to weigh up whether that's something I should be doing. I'll talk about that more in the video on congruence. And it's really important to check out your understanding with the client on a fairly regular basis, because that's the barometer by which you know whether or not your attempt at empathizing is accurate. I feel as though, basically, if I'm here and the client is here, if we go ages without me checking in my understanding, then there's a bigger and bigger and bigger possibility that my understanding is going to be really far off. And even if it's accurate, to be honest, if it's been, let's say, 20 minutes before I've confirmed my understanding and checked that out with the client, then I have to put a real effort in to do justice to the last 20 minutes of what the client said. 20 minutes is an arbitrary figure. It could be 10 or 15 or whatever, but I think the longer I leave it between checking things out and checking my understanding, the bigger gap there might be. And also, the bigger effort is involved in me really doing justice to everything they've covered. In my opinion, and as I've got more experience, I found myself changing this way. I found it better to check in slightly more often, certainly than I used to when I first started training. So now I check in much more often, much quicker, and it can be just a few words or a single sentence just to summarise my understanding and check where I'm at with them. Then I know I'm with them, and I can really focus on them rather than trying to remember the meaning and the emotion involved in everything they've said over the last few minutes. If I feel as though I'm not 100% sure that I'm in line with what they're saying, I will check in and make sure, and they'll correct me, hopefully. When I meet a client for the first time, I try and make it as clear as possible that if I'm only 90% accurate, please give me that other 10%. Let me know in any way in which I'm not right. I try and be empathic, but I'm not psychic, and you telling me any ways in which my understanding is at odds with what's actually happening is really good, because my aim is to genuinely understand. I've heard empathy described as a dance, which I quite like, because it suggests and shows that it's an ongoing process. The client talks and I express how I've experienced things, and I get that feedback about whether or not it's accurate. Let's say it is accurate, and then the client continues to talk, and then I respond in kind and express how I've experienced things and what I've heard and how I've understood it. And yeah, it's a dance. I think that's a really lovely way of putting it. The client's moving and going wherever they want to go, and I'm, as best I can, moving with them. It's because I see empathy as an ongoing process, as a dance, that I struggle with when people describe themselves as empaths. I find that suggests empathy to be too much of a fixed thing. It suggests that it's automatic, like you walk around and you just empathise with everybody. I find it difficult, and I don't think I'd ever want to describe myself as an empath. It feels quite presumptuous to me, because I don't know if I'm empathising at any given moment. I only know that I'm empathising with a client throughout a session when I get that feedback from the client. If I'm walking down the street, I might have all kinds of feelings in response to things people say or do, but I don't know if that's empathy and picking up on their feelings, or if I'm just having feelings of my own. I don't know if it's empathy or just projection until I check it out and get that feedback. Otherwise, there's no way of knowing either way, I don't think. If I go into a session deciding that I'm an empath, then I think I'm less likely to want to get that feedback from a client, because I'm overconfident that I've got it right already. And I think it's really important to make a distinction between empathy, when you step into a client's frame of reference and can sense their feelings and get that feedback, and having feelings in response to what you're hearing. If I'm on the street and I'm hearing somebody talk about something tragic that's happened, I may have really strong, compassionate feelings in response to that, but those are my feelings rather than picking up on the feelings in the person who's saying things. And I feel as though in that way, maybe empathy as used in this context is different from how it can be used in common parlance in the day-to-day world. I personally don't want to assume that I'm being empathic, though. I only know I'm being empathic when I get that confirmation that my understanding is accurate. That's the only way in which I'd ever regard myself as an empath in a particular context, when I have accurately picked up on what someone's feeling and how they're experiencing things. That's why I'm so careful and tentative when I'm expressing myself. I make it clear that this is how I'm experiencing it, and asking if that sits right, if that resonates, and being as open as possible to being told if it doesn't. And with some clients it might just click and my empathy seems to be quite intuitively accurate, and we're able to have an empathic connection quite quickly. With others that might not be the case. It might take a bit longer. With others still, they might not be very communicative in a traditional kind of way. Some people who struggle with their mental health may be in a state of dissociation or psychosis, in which case you may be left trying to empathise with this person, but often feeling like their inner world is a complete mystery to you. And that just means it's all the more important to pay extra careful attention to any data that you're getting from them, anything at all, and to step into their world as best you can, even if it's clouded with mystery, even if you feel as though you really don't get it. Depending on the circumstances, it may well be unlikely that anyone else in their life is trying as hard as you are to understand, especially in such a focused way as a person gets in therapy. And so what feels to you like a gap may well feel to them like the closest thing they've got to a connection to their inner world from the outside. Either way, whether it's someone you really feel you've got some relational depth with from the moment you meet them, to somebody who you struggle to feel as though you have any kind of psychological contact with, your attitude always needs to be to try and understand on an ongoing basis what their inner world is like, what meaning they're finding in their experience, and to try and figure out a way to communicate that with them as sensitively as possible in a way that is most likely to be received and really heard.